The morning Reuben Wilcox rode into Caldwell, Kansas with a sealed letter in his breast pocket and a hollow feeling in his chest. He had no idea that the woman waiting at the edge of town would become the reason he questioned every promise he had ever made. It was the spring of 1878, and the prairie wind was doing what it always did in April, sweeping down from the north in great invisible walls that bent the tall grass flat and sent dust devils spinning across the hardpan road. Reuben pulled his brown hat lower over his forehead and squinted against the grit. He was 27 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had spent more years gripping fence posts and saddle leather than anything soft. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that jutted out of the Kansas hillsides, and eyes the color of rain-soaked sage, a gray-green that people in Caldwell had learned to read the way they read the sky. When those eyes went flat and still, trouble was coming. When they softened, which was rare enough that folks remarked on it, something had gotten past the wall he kept around himself. He worked for a man named Gerald Halstead, who ran a freight and escort operation out of a wide adobe building on the main street of Caldwell. Halstead moved goods, messages, and occasionally people across the territories, and he paid men like Reuben to make sure everything arrived intact. It was honest work, if not particularly warm work, and Reuben had spent 4 years doing it without complaint. He was reliable. He was careful. He did not ask questions about the cargo, whether that cargo was crates of dry goods or legal documents, or, as it turned out, a woman being delivered to a man she had never met. He tied his roan horse, a steady animal he called Bishop, to the post outside Halstead's office and went inside. Gerald Halstead was a thick man with a white mustache that he twisted when he was thinking, and he was twisting it now as Reuben came through the door. He set down his coffee cup and pushed a folded paper across the desk. "I have a job that requires someone particular," Halstead said, studying Reuben with the assessing gaze of a man who has been deciding the worth of things his entire life. Reuben picked up the paper without sitting down. He read it twice. The arrangement was simple on its surface. A woman named Grace Talmadge, age 23, was currently staying at the Prairie Rose boarding house on 2nd Street. She had traveled from Cincinnati by rail to Wichita and then by stage to Caldwell, and she was expected to continue her journey westward to a town called Red Fork, some 60 miles deeper into the Oklahoma Territory. In Red Fork, a cattle baron named Silas Drummond was waiting for her. Drummond had placed an advertisement in an Eastern newspaper seeking a wife of good character and education. Grace Talmadge had answered it, and the agreement had been formalized through letters over the course of several months. All that remained was the physical delivery, so to speak, of Miss Talmadge from Caldwell to Red Fork, where she would be married within the week. Reuben had done this kind of work before. Twice, actually. He had escorted 2 women west under similar circumstances, and both times it had been straightforward long rides, brief conversations, and then a handoff at the other end. He was professional about it. He treated the women with courtesy and asked nothing personal of them. He supposed they were making their own choices, or something close enough to choices that the distinction did not keep him awake at night. 60 miles, Reuben said, setting the paper back on the desk. 2 days if the weather holds. Who's the woman? Schoolteacher from Ohio, Halstead said. Or she was. Drummond specifically asked for someone educated. Wants a wife who can teach his children and manage a household with some intelligence. She came out of her own will, so I am told, and she has signed the agreement. What's the pay? $12 and a new saddle blanket, which you've needed for going on 3 months now. Reuben almost smiled. Halstead noticed small things. It was part of why the man was good at his business. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning. She's expecting you at 7 o'clock. Reuben left Halstead's office and spent the remainder of the afternoon tending to Bishop, eating a quiet supper at the saloon, soup, bread, and coffee, because he did not drink, and sharpening his knife out of habit rather than any particular need. He went to bed in the small room he kept above the livery stable and stared at the ceiling for a while, thinking about nothing in particular, which was usually how he fell asleep. He was at the Prairie Rose at 6:50 the following morning. The boarding house was a white-painted building with a narrow porch and window boxes that someone was trying to coax geraniums out of, with only partial success. The landlady, a stout woman named Mrs. Petty, met him at the door and ushered him into a small parlor that smelled of beeswax and dried lavender. She told him Miss Talmadge would be down directly, then disappeared toward the kitchen. Reuben stood in the parlor with his hat in his hands, taking in the room without meaning to a framed sampler on the wall, a horsehair settee, a stack of books on the side table. He moved toward the books reflexively, the way a man moves toward a fire in a cold room, and he was reading the Spine's George Eliot, a geography text, a worn copy of something by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Grace Talmadge was not what he had expected, which was foolish of him, because he had not expected anything in particular. She was of medium height, with dark auburn hair pulled back from her face in a way that suggested she had tried to make it tidy, and the wind had already begun undoing her work. She wore a gray traveling dress and a short jacket the color of dried moss, and she carried a single leather satchel that she had not entrusted to anyone else. Her face was not conventionally beautiful in the manner of the women in the illustrated newspapers. It was sharper, more specific, with high cheekbones and a straight mouth and brown eyes that were currently doing something complicated. They were afraid, Reuben realized. She was afraid, and she was working very hard not to show it, and the combination of those two things, the fear and the effort to contain it, struck him somewhere between the ribs with a force he had not anticipated. "You are Mr. Wilcox," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am, Reuben Wilcox. I'll be taking you to Red Fork." Something crossed her face at the words Red Fork, but it was brief, like a cloud shadow moving across open ground. She nodded and adjusted her grip on the satchel. "I am ready," she said, "Mrs." Petty came back with a wrapped parcel of food for the road, pressed it into Grace's hands with the murmuring affection of a woman who had known her guest only 2 days but had apparently decided she was worth caring about. And then they were outside in the sharp morning air, and Reuben was loading her trunk onto the pack mule he had hired for the journey. The trunk was heavier than he expected. He did not say so. Grace Talmadge watched him work with an expression he could not immediately categorize. Appraising, maybe, cautious. "How long have you done this?" she asked. "Escorting people, I mean." "For years," he said, tightening a strap. "You'll be safe, Miss Talmadge." "That's my job, and I take it seriously." "I'm not worried about safety," she said, which he did not quite believe. "Then what are you worried about?" he asked, and then immediately regretted it because it was not the kind of question he typically asked. He kept his professional distance. He was good at professional distance. She looked at him steadily. "Whether 60 miles is long enough to decide if you've made the right choice," she said, and then she walked to where Bishop was tied and waited for him to help her onto the hired mare that stood beside his horse. They rode out of Caldwell as the sun cleared the horizon, painting the prairie in long strokes of copper and amber. For the first several miles, they did not speak much, and Reuben was grateful for it because the silence gave him time to recalibrate something inside himself that had been unexpectedly knocked loose. He watched the road ahead and did what he always did, scanned the tree lines, checked the positions of distant riders when they appeared, noted the condition of the creek crossings. The Oklahoma Territory was not lawless exactly, but it had its share of men who made poor decisions when they saw a woman traveling with only one escort and a loaded pack mule. He kept alert, which helped him keep his mind where it belonged. But Grace Talmadge did not make it easy. By mid-morning she had begun talking, not in the anxious way of someone filling silence out of nerves, but in the considered way of a person who had decided that since she was spending 2 days with a stranger, she might as well know who he was. She asked about the land, and he told her what he knew of it, the history of the cattle trails, the way the territory had shifted since the late Civil War years, the the particular beauty of the prairie in spring before the summer heat turned everything to bronze. She listened with genuine attention, asking follow-up questions that showed she had actually processed what he said, rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. She told him in return about Cincinnati, about the schoolroom where she had taught for 3 years, the children whose names she still remembered, the specific satisfaction of the moment when a child who had been struggling with arithmetic suddenly understood a problem, and their face changed. She talked about it the way people talk about something they have given up with love, and with the deliberate forward momentum of someone who has decided not to look back. "Why did you answer the advertisement?" Reuben asked, and then again felt he had overstepped, because it was not his business, and because the answer might be something she did not want to examine. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he thought she was going to decline to answer. The horse's hooves made their rhythmic sound against the dry ground, and a meadowlark sang somewhere to the left. "My mother died last autumn," she said at last. "She was the last of my family in Cincinnati. And the school, there was a new man on the board who thought women teachers should be replaced by men once the boys in class reached a certain age. He was going to let me go in June." She paused. "I had a small amount of savings and a very clear sense that I needed to make a decision before the decision was made for me. Mr. Drummond's advertisement said he wanted a woman of education and good character. I thought I qualified on both counts." Reuben considered that. There was a practicality to it that he understood and respected. She had not dressed the thing up in sentiment, but underneath the practicality he could hear what she had not said, that there had been loneliness and loss and a kind of desperate courage in answering that advertisement. "Have you met him?" he asked. "Drummond. We exchanged letters," she said. "He seems decisive, organized. He manages a large property which requires discipline." She said it like a woman reading the positive portion of a balance sheet. The negative portion went unread, but he could feel its weight. "Is that enough?" Reuben asked. "To build a life on?" She turned to look at him then, and there was something sharp and honest in her brown eyes. "I'm not sure what is enough," she said. "I'm sure that staying in Cincinnati with no work and no family and spending my savings on a rented room would eventually leave me with no choices at all. This at least is a choice." He nodded slowly. It was hard to argue with that. The world in 1878 did not offer women a great many doors, and she had found one and was walking through it. He respected that, even as something in him, something he had no right to feel on a morning's acquaintance, quietly objected. They stopped at midday beside a creek lined with cottonwoods that were just beginning to leaf out in their pale spring green. Reuben watered the horses while Grace spread the contents of Mrs. Petty's parcel on a flat rock: cornbread, hard-boiled eggs, dried peaches, and a small jar of preserves that made Grace smile when she unwrapped it. "Gooseberry," she said. "I told her it was my favorite," she remembered. It was such a small thing. But the way she said it, with genuine warmth, with the pleasure of being remembered, made Reuben feel something shift again inside his chest. He sat down on a nearby rock and ate his cornbread and watched the cottonwood reflections in the creek water and tried to locate his professional composure, which had apparently wandered off sometime during the morning. "What about you?" Grace asked. She was sitting across from him, neat despite the trail dust, spreading a careful amount of preserves on her bread. "How did you come to be in Caldwell doing this kind of work?" "I grew up in Missouri," he said. "Worked my family's farm until I was 22. Then my father died and my 2 brothers took over the farm between them, and I found I was more useful as an extra hand than as a partner, so I went west." He said it simply, without self-pity, because it was simply what had happened. "Do you miss it, Missouri?" "Sometimes. I miss the smell of it in summer, and the river." He paused. "I don't miss the arguments about who decides what gets planted." She laughed at that, a quick, genuine sound that startled a small bird out of the cottonwoods, and Reuben felt the strange and somewhat alarming experience of wanting to make her laugh again. They rode through the afternoon. The land changed gradually as they moved south and west, the flat-topped buttes beginning to appear on the horizon, the grass shifting in character, the sky growing somehow larger. Grace rode well, better than he expected, and when he mentioned it she told him she had grown up with horses on her grandfather's farm in rural Ohio before her family moved to the city. "I miss riding," she said quietly, looking at the horizon. "In the city there was no reason to, and no room for it. This," she gestured at the wide land ahead of them, "this part I don't mind. The riding or the space. Both," she said. "It's frightening and beautiful in equal measure." I didn't expect to feel both things at once. Reuben thought he understood exactly what she meant, though he was not thinking about the landscape. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up from the southwest, carrying the smell of rain that might or might not arrive, and they pushed the horses to make a small ranch settlement Reuben knew of, a place called Hauler's Rest, where a family named Hauler ran a handful of spare rooms for travelers and served hot food in their kitchen for a modest price. They arrived as the first clouds were building in the west, and Martha Hauler, a cheerful woman of 50 with paint-stained hands that suggested she was an artist who cooked for necessity, showed them their respective rooms and told them supper would be salt pork, beans, and corn, which turned out to be considerably better than it sounded. The Hauler family, Martha, her husband David, their 2 adult sons, and a daughter of 16 who stared at Grace with unconcealed admiration, shared the table with them, and the meal was loud and warm and full of conversation about the spring cattle movement, and a dispute over water rights 2 properties north, and a new post office rumored to be coming to a nearby settlement. Reuben watched Grace at the table and saw her transform, the careful composure from the morning loosening, her laugh coming more easily, her questions to the Haulers showing genuine curiosity about their lives. She helped Martha clear the table afterward, and Reuben heard them talking in the kitchen while he sat on the porch with David Hauler, who offered him a pipe and told him 3 separate stories about difficult weather in the territory, each one embellished more than the last. By the time Martha and Grace came back to the porch, the clouds had covered most of the sky and the air had the electric, green-tinged quality of approaching storms. "You'd best stay until morning at least," David Hauler said, tilting his head at the sky. "That's not going to pass quickly." The rain began an hour later, hammering the roof in long, sustained waves that made the lamp flames waver. Reuben sat in the small common room with Grace while the Hauler family retired to their side of the house, and in the yellow lamplight with the rain loud outside and the world reduced to the circle of warmth they occupied, he found that the careful professional distance he had been maintaining all day had contracted to something much smaller and much less manageable. They talked about books. It started because Grace noticed the worn Longfellow collection in his saddlebag. He had not meant for her to see it, but she had sharp eyes and a forthright manner. "You read poetry," she said, and there was no particular judgment in it, only genuine surprise. "My mother liked it," he said. "She used to read to us in the evenings. I kept the habit." "Which poem do you go back to most?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "There's one called The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls," he said at last. "It's short, but it has a weight to it. The sea keeps coming in regardless. The world doesn't stop for any particular loss." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "That's either comforting or very sad depending on the day," she said softly. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what it is." She was quiet after that, and he was quiet, and the rain kept falling, and outside in the dark the prairie was being drenched and renewed in the way it always was, indifferent and magnificent. "Tell me about Drummond," he said eventually. He needed to say the name. He needed to remind himself and possibly her of why they were here. She shifted slightly. "He owns approximately 8,000 acres, she said, in the careful voice she used when she was presenting facts rather than feelings. "He has 2 children from his first wife, who passed 3 years ago, a son of 12 and a daughter of 9. He described himself as direct and practical, which I understand to mean he is not a man of easy warmth, but he was unfailingly respectful in his letters, and he made it clear that he would provide well." "Does he know you?" Reuben asked. "The real you, the books, the laughing, the gooseberry preserves." She blinked. Something moved across her face that he might have called vulnerability if he had been more reckless with his interpretations. "I wrote honestly," she said carefully. "But letters," she paused and looked at her hands, "letters are a kind of performance, I think. You choose which truths to show and in what order." "Yes," Reuben said, more quietly than he intended. "That's true. Have you ever written letters to a woman?" she asked, and there was nothing coy in the question. It was simply curiosity. "No," he said. "There was a woman in Caldwell 2 years ago for a short while, but she wanted someone who was going to stay in one place and plant things, and that wasn't me." "What are you?" she asked, not unkindly, with genuine interest. He turned the coffee cup again. "I'm not sure yet," he said. "I know what I'm good at. I know what the land feels like under my hands. I know that I'd rather sleep under a wide sky than in a city. But what I want," he stopped. "That's still forming, I think." She nodded slowly, as if she recognized the experience from the inside. They said good night shortly after that, and Reuben lay in his narrow room listening to the rain on the roof above him, staring at the ceiling, and feeling with increasing and uncomfortable clarity that something was happening to him that had no business happening, and that he did not know what to do about it. The morning arrived clean and bright, the way mornings do after heavy spring rain, the air scrubbed transparent, every color intensified, the wet grass glittering in the early light. The road was soft in places but passable, and they made their farewells to the Haller family and rode out by 7:30. Martha Haller hugged Grace goodbye the way she might have hugged a daughter, and Reuben saw the way Grace held onto it for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and he had to look away. The second day on the trail was different from the first. The careful formalities of strangers had worn thinner overnight, and they rode with the easy rhythm of two people who have gotten past the initial performance of themselves and are beginning to show the actual shape of who they are. Grace sang, quietly and without self-consciousness, somewhere around mid-morning. She was riding a few horse lengths ahead when he heard it, something he recognized as a hymn, though he couldn't place the exact one, her voice low and clear against the enormous silence of the prairie. "You have a fine voice," he said when the song ended. She glanced back at him, her cheeks colored. "I didn't realize I'd started. I used to sing in church when I was small. I forget myself sometimes when the air is like this." "Don't stop on my account," he said, and meant it. She turned back to the road ahead, but he heard her pick up the song again, softer now, and it was one of the most unexpectedly lovely things he could remember experiencing, that voice, and the vast sunlit prairie and the sound of the horses walking. He did not say that. He thought it very completely, but he did not say it. They stopped for water and a brief rest around midday, and as they sat in the shade of a limestone outcropping, Grace pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket. He recognized the shape of a letter. She held it without opening it, looking at it in a way that was complicated. "Drummond's last letter," she said after a moment. Reuben said nothing. He watched the horizon and let her have whatever she was doing with the letter. He outlined the household schedule, she said. "Breakfast at 6 precisely, supper at 5:30. He said the children are well behaved but require a firm hand." She paused. "He said the previous housekeeper was dismissed for speaking out of turn." Reuben's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice neutral. "What does that mean, speaking out of turn?" "I don't know precisely." He didn't elaborate. She folded the letter again and pressed it flat between her palms. "He is orderly and certain about things. I understand the value of that." "You keep saying that," Reuben said, and it came out more gently than he intended. "That you understand the value of it, but do you want it?" She was very quiet. The wind moved the grass in long silver waves across the hillside below them. A red-tailed hawk circled slowly in the blue above. "I'm not sure wanting things is a luxury I've allowed myself very much," she said at last, and her voice was so honest and so exposed in that admission that Reuben's chest ached with it. "I think you should," he said. "Allow it, I mean." She looked at him. He was aware of the distance between them, a few feet, no more, and of the way the morning light caught the auburn in her hair. He was aware that he was a man being paid to deliver this woman to another man, and that the thoughts he was currently having were well outside the scope of that professional arrangement. He stood up and brushed the dust from his trousers. "We should keep moving," he said. "We'll reach Red Fork before sundown if we make good time." He felt her hesitate before she stood. He helped her back onto her mare and they rode on, and the distance between them felt smaller than the physical space between two horses and two riders should have permitted. Red Fork appeared on the horizon by late afternoon, a cluster of buildings that resolved slowly as they approached into a more substantial settlement than Reuben had expected. There was a proper main street, a large general store, a livery, a church with a white steeple, and numerous other establishments that spoke of a town with real money behind it, which was consistent with what he knew of Silas Drummond's reputation. A rider came out to meet them when they were still half a mile from town. He was a lean young man with the clipped efficiency of an employee doing exactly what he had been told to do, and he introduced himself as Drummond's foreman, a man named Cole, sent to escort Miss Talmadge the final distance to the Drummond property, which lay 3 miles north of town. "Mr. Drummond is expecting you," Cole said, addressing Grace with a formal nod. "He has asked that you come straight out to the ranch. The Reverend will come tomorrow morning for the formal ceremony." Tomorrow morning. Reuben heard the words and something in him went very still and very cold, the way water goes still just before it freezes. Grace heard them too. He saw it in the set of her shoulders, the small upward motion of her chin that was either resolve or the physical management of fear, and he could not tell which. "Very well," she said. Her voice was composed. "Perfect." Cole turned his horse north and looked at Reuben with the efficient dismissal of a man whose employer was important enough to make other men feel peripheral. "I'll take her from here. Mr. Halstead has been notified of your completion of service. You'll receive your pay in Caldwell." This was the moment. This was exactly and precisely the moment that Reuben Wilcox had executed in some form twice before without difficulty. The handoff, the professional conclusion, the turning of his horse back in the direction he came from. He had the $12 and the saddle blanket waiting for him. He had done the job. All he had to do was tip his hat, say something brief and appropriate to Grace Talmadge, and ride away. He looked at Grace. She was looking at the road that led north, toward Drummond's property, toward tomorrow morning and a ceremony, and a household with a breakfast schedule, and a foreman and a housekeeper, who had been dismissed for speaking out of turn. Her hands were perfectly still on her reins. Her face was composed, and in her eyes, in the brown eyes that had been so honest with him across 2 days of prairie and rain and firelight, there was something that he had to name because not naming it would be dishonest, and he was a man who was trying in the ways available to him to be honest. She was not all right. She was afraid, and not in the way you are afraid of a difficult thing you have chosen freely and are moving toward with confidence. She was afraid in the way you are afraid of a door swinging shut behind you. Cole was already beginning to move his horse forward, assuming Grace would follow. The pack mule's lead rope was in Cole's hand now, Reuben having passed it over during the brief exchange. "Miss Talmadge," Reuben said. She turned, just that she turned and looked at him. "You don't have to," he said quietly so Cole would not hear it. She stared at him, the composed mask fractured slightly at the edges. "I have an agreement," she said, just as quietly. "An agreement is not a law," he said, "and you are not a piece of freight." Something crossed her face that was equal parts relief and terror, because someone had said the thing she had been thinking in the darkest part of herself and pretending she had not been thinking, and hearing it spoken aloud made it real and also made it dangerous. "Mr. Wilcox," Cole said from ahead of them, a sharp edge in his voice now. "Miss Talmadge." Grace looked at Cole. She looked at the road north. She looked at Reuben. He did not push. He had said what he had to say, and he would not push further, because it was her life and her choice. And he had meant every word he had said to her about allowing herself to want things, and that applied equally to this moment. Whatever she chose, he would respect it. She turned her horse south, not north, south, back toward Caldwell. Cole made a sharp sound of protest and pulled his horse around. Miss Talmadge, Mr. Drummond is expecting. Please tell Mr. Drummond that I am sorry, Grace said, and her voice was clear and steady with the specific steadiness of a person who has made a decision and is now on the far side of the making of it. Tell him I was not the right person for the arrangement and that I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. You cannot simply, Cole began. She can, Reuben said. He moved Bishop to position himself between Cole and Grace's retreating mare, not aggressively, simply as a statement of fact. The lady has made her decision. There is no legal compulsion here. Cole stared at him with barely contained fury. Drummond will hear of this. I expect he will, Reuben said. Cole pulled his horse around and rode hard toward town, presumably to send a wire to his employer, and Reuben turned Bishop and caught up with Grace, who had not looked back. They rode side by side for a quarter-mile before either of them spoke. What have I done? She said, and it was not quite a question. I think you've decided something, Reuben said. I have no money to speak of. No position to return to. No, she stopped, pressed her lips together, and took a breath. I've broken an agreement with a powerful man in his own territory. What will Drummond do? He'll be angry, Reuben said honestly. He might write a letter of complaint to Halstead. He might try to pressure you legally, though I doubt he'll get far. You haven't committed any crime. He might make things difficult. He paused. But he cannot force you to marry him. And you? She asked, and now there was something very direct and very vulnerable in her voice. You've just refused to complete your job. What does that mean for you? Reuben thought about Gerald Halstead's office. He thought about the $12 and the saddle blanket. He thought about the way she had looked at the road north and the way he had been absolutely unable to watch her ride down it. I'll deal with Halstead, he said. It's my choice to make. She was quiet for a long time. Why? She asked at last. You don't know me. We've been riding for 2 days. You have a job and a life, and I am nothing to you except a woman you were paid to deliver somewhere. Why? He was quiet for a while, looking at the road ahead and the sun lowering toward the western horizon. He was not a man who spoke his interior easily. He had spent years being good at not speaking his interior. But she had asked directly, and she deserved a direct answer, and he was, as he had noted, a man trying to be honest. Because I would rather lose the job than watch you walk through a door that frightens you, he said. Because in 2 days you have shown me more genuine life than I have seen in, he stopped, tried again. Because the idea of you sitting at that man's breakfast table at precisely 6 o'clock every morning, and becoming smaller and smaller until there's nothing left of the woman who laughs at a meadowlark, is something I cannot accommodate. That's why. The words landed between them in the still air like stones dropped in deep water. Grace made a sound that was not quite a word. She looked at him with those honest brown eyes, and for a moment she was fully unguarded, no composure, no performance, just the actual woman underneath all of it, startled and moved and a little frightened, which he understood because he felt something similar. Reuben, she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without the formal title. I know, he said. I know I have no right to feel what I'm feeling. I know the timing is wrong and the circumstances are, I know all of that. I'm not asking you for anything. I just could not hand you over. You're not asking for anything, she said slowly, like she was testing the shape of the words. No, he said. She was quiet again. They kept riding. Then I am asking, she said at last, very softly. He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead, her chin lifted, her profile against the evening sky. I'm asking you to tell me what you meant, she said. Not what you can't do, but what you actually want. Because you told me I should allow myself to want things, and I think that applies to both of us. He breathed. The roan horse walked steadily beneath him. The prairie opened up in all directions, enormous and patient and full of the particular beauty of a world that was not waiting for any human being to make up their mind before it continued being magnificent. I want to know you better, he said. I want to know what else is in those books you packed. I want to hear you sing when you forget yourself. I want to give you reasons to stay in one place, if that's something you'd want. And he stopped and then continued honestly, I want to be the one who's there, at your table, in your life, if that is something you could consider. She turned to look at him then. The last light of the day was amber and warm, and it lit her face, and the look in her eyes was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life, open and astonished and beginning, very quietly and carefully, to be glad. That is something I could consider, she said. They rode back into Caldwell as the stars were coming out, and Reuben took her to the Prairie Rose and got her room back from Mrs. Petty, who had not yet let it to anyone else and who asked no questions, though her expression suggested she understood more than was being said. Then Reuben went to find Gerald Halstead, who was still in his office, the way Halstead always was when he was expecting a difficult conversation. The conversation was, in fact, difficult. Halstead was not an unkind man, but he ran a business on his reputation, and having an escort refuse to complete a delivery was not the kind of thing his reputation could easily absorb. He told Reuben this in measured, deliberate terms, sitting behind his desk with his white mustache untwisted for once, which meant he was genuinely troubled rather than merely thinking. Reuben explained what he had observed. He did not dress it up, but he was precise. The letter that Grace had described, the foreman's manner, the ceremony scheduled for the following morning, and his clear assessment that the woman's freedom of choice was the paramount consideration. Halstead listened without interrupting, which Reuben appreciated. Drummond is going to contact me, Halstead said when Reuben finished. Yes, Reuben said. I know. I'm sorry for the difficulty. Halstead looked at him for a long moment. He twisted the mustache once thoughtfully. Was she in genuine distress, or is this a matter of you having personal feelings that interfered with your professional judgment? Reuben met the older man's gaze steadily. Both, he said, and I understand if that means I'm no longer employed here. Halstead was quiet for a long time. Outside, someone was playing a fiddle somewhere down the street, a bright dancing sound that was incongruous with the seriousness of the room. You're a good escort, Halstead said finally. You've never given me a moment's trouble in 4 years, and I'll tell you something. He leaned back in his chair. I've sent people to Drummond's property before. Goods, documents. His foreman is an unpleasant man, and the stories that come back from that operation are not warm ones. He paused. I'll manage Drummond. Reuben nodded slowly. And my position? You still work for me, Halstead said. But you'll take a smaller route for a while, and you'll give me time to smooth this over. Deal. Deal, Reuben said. He did not tell Halstead everything. He did not tell him about the amber evening light or the way Grace Talmadge had said that is something I could consider. Those things belonged to him alone, at least for now. The days that followed moved with the peculiar quality of time that knows it is doing something important. Reuben took the smaller route, a mail run between Caldwell and 2 nearby settlements, and returned each evening to Caldwell, which he had not previously done, having usually continued on to the next job. Now he returned. Grace was at the Prairie Rose initially, but within the week she had spoken to the teacher at Caldwell's small schoolhouse, a tired, overworked man named Mr. Aldous, who was managing 32 children across 3 grade levels by himself, and offered her services. Aldous had very nearly wept with relief. She was installed as his assistant within the week, and because she brought her Ohio teaching certificates and 3 years of documented experience, the school board approved her salary, which was modest but sufficient to pay for her room and her meals. She was, Reuben observed, very good at the work. He walked past the schoolhouse one afternoon and heard her voice through the open window, clear and patient and warm, asking a child to try the arithmetic problem again. You're nearly there. Just look at the first number again carefully. He stood outside for a moment longer than was entirely necessary. He had supper with her at the Prairie Rose 3 evenings in that first week, and they talked in the way that they had talked on the trail, honestly, curiously, ranging across subjects with the ease of 2 people who find each other genuinely interesting. She told him more about her childhood. He told her more about Missouri and the farm. She asked him once what had frightened him, and he thought about it seriously before answering, and that seriousness seemed to please her in some way she did not fully articulate but that he could see. Most men answer that immediately, she said, with something that doesn't actually frighten them, something they're proud of not being afraid of. What would be the point of that, he said. Exactly, she said. What he had told her after the thinking was this, that he was frightened of becoming a man who was useful but not known. A man who served a function in other people's lives, escort, hand, employee, but was not deeply known by anyone. He was frightened of arriving at the end of his life and realizing the years had been competently managed but essentially solitary. She had looked at him for a long time after that. You don't have to be, she said quietly. That's not a fixed thing. I know, he said. I'm working on it. On a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after their arrival back in Caldwell, they walked along the creek outside town as the day cooled. It was a warm evening, the cottonwoods fully leafed now, their round green crowns making soft rushing sounds in the breeze. Reuben had brought the Longfellow book without quite planning to, and at some point he read her the poem he had told her about, sitting on the grassy bank while she listened with her knees drawn up and her shoes beside her, her bare feet in the grass. When he finished reading, the silence was the most comfortable silence he had ever inhabited. "The world doesn't stop for any particular loss," she quoted back to him. "But you stopped," she said, "for me, when you could have kept going." "I could not have kept going," he said. "I want to be precise about that. It was not something I chose so much as something I discovered was not possible." She turned to look at him. There was a blade of grass in her hair that she did not know about, and the evening light was doing what it always did to auburn hair, which was to set it on fire with copper and gold. She was beautiful, he thought, in the specific way that specific people become beautiful. Not because of any single feature, but because of the combination of the person and the moment, and the feeling of being near them. "Reuben," she said, and then she reached out and put her hand over his where it lay on the grass, and his whole chest went entirely still. They stayed there like that, her hand on his, the creek making its quiet sound, the cottonwoods moving in the warm evening air, while the sky turned the sequence of colors that a Kansas sky does when it's showing off amber, then rose, then a deep violet that made the first stars visible before the light was fully gone. He turned his hand over and held hers. They walked back to town as the dark came on, her hand in his, and neither of them felt it necessary to speak, because some things are communicated more completely by the warmth of a hand and the matching rhythm of two people walking together than by any arrangement of words. The following weeks brought the further deepening of something that had begun, Reuben supposed, in the first moments of seeing her in that parlor. The specific quality of attention she brought to everything, the way she laughed, the loyalty she was already showing to the children in her classroom, the rare but devastating moments when she was unsure of herself and showed it without pretense. He was falling in love with her in the full, inconvenient, generous way, not with an idea of her, but with the actual woman, the one who was sometimes impatient, who occasionally made pronouncements that turned out to be wrong, who could be stubborn about certain opinions, and who was, for all her composure, deeply emotional about things she cared about. She was falling in love with him too. He could see it in the way she looked for him when he came back from his mail runs, in the way she saved observations from her day to tell him, in the way she said his name always with a particular warmth, always with the ease of someone for whom the name has become associated with everything good and safe. He proposed to her on an evening in late May, on the same bank of the same creek, with the cottonwoods overhead and the meadowlarks making their evening sounds. He did not have a ring. He told her he would get one, that he had enough saved, and that he knew a jeweler in Wichita. But first he wanted to ask, because the asking mattered to him independently of the ring, and he did not want the ring to carry the weight of the question. He wanted the question to carry its own weight. He asked her very directly, sitting beside her in the grass, his hat in his hands, because he was nervous enough that doing something with his hands helped, and what he said was, "I would like to build a life with you, Grace. Everything I have and everything I am, I would put toward that life. I know I don't have great wealth, and I know Caldwell is not Cincinnati, and I know the conditions I'm offering are not the conditions that Drummond's letter described. But I would like to try if you'll have me. I am asking if you will marry me." She had been listening to him with absolute attention, completely still, her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she was quiet for precisely 4 seconds. He counted them involuntarily, and then she said, "Yes. Of course, yes. Reuben, I have been waiting for weeks for you to ask." He laughed, which surprised him, and she laughed too. And then they were both laughing in the long grass by the creek with the meadowlarks sounding off all around them. And he reached out and tucked the perpetual strand of hair behind her ear. And she leaned into his hand for just a moment. And then he kissed her for the first time carefully, with all the intention he had been carefully banking for weeks. And she kissed him back with equal care and equal intention, and the creek went on with its quiet business. Undisturbed, Gerald Halstead, when told, shook Reuben's hand with genuine warmth and told him he was an idiot who had taken far too long to ask, and that Mrs. Petty at the Prairie Rose had put $1 on a wager with the livery owner that it would happen before June. Mrs. Petty had won the $1. The matter of Silas Drummond resolved itself more quietly than Reuben had feared, though not without a period of tension. Drummond had sent a letter to Halstead that was cold and imperious, demanding some form of accounting for what he called the breach of the arrangement. Halstead had written back with the calm authority of a man who knew his legal ground, noting that Grace Talmadge had entered into no binding legal contract. The arrangement had been a voluntary agreement, not a legally enforceable one, and that she had withdrawn before the ceremony rather than after. He had also made certain careful inquiries through contacts in the territory about Drummond's general reputation, and had discovered enough corroborating detail about the man's management of his household and employees to feel comfortable in his position. Drummond had written one more letter, to Grace directly, which arrived at the Prairie Rose. She showed it to Reuben. It was not threatening precisely, but it was the kind of communication designed to make a person feel small and foolish, pointing out her circumstances, her lack of prospects, her impulsive decision, the difficulty she would face. It ended with the suggestion that the offer was still open if she reconsidered within the month. Grace read it twice, folded it very precisely, and wrote a response that Reuben was not asked to help compose. She read it to him afterward. It was brief and dignified, and stated simply that she had reconsidered, that she had made a different arrangement that suited her considerably better, that she wished Mr. Drummond well in finding a more compatible partner, and that she would not be corresponding further on the matter. She signed it Grace Talmadge, which was, she noted with some satisfaction, a name she intended to change very shortly through a different and far more welcome means. She sent it the next morning. Drummond did not reply. The matter was closed. They married on a Wednesday morning in June at the Caldwell Church, which was a plain wooden building that was nonetheless warm with light on that particular morning. The Reverend was a round-faced man named Mr. Beecham, who was visibly pleased by the whole occasion. The witnesses were Gerald Halstead and Martha Haller, who had driven in from the settlement specifically, and Mrs. Petty, who cried from the moment Grace appeared in the doorway, wearing a blue dress she had made herself from fabric she had chosen at the general store with the careful deliberation of someone spending money that meant something. The dress was a deep, warm blue that made her eyes look darker and her hair look like autumn. Reuben wore his good jacket and a new shirt that he had purchased from the same general store, feeling slightly unlike himself and also perfectly like himself, which was a contradictory sensation that he had decided was probably normal. When Reverend Beecham reached the part of the ceremony where he asked Grace if she took this man willingly and of her own free choice, she answered with a clarity and a directness that made Mrs. Petty cry harder, and made Reuben's chest do the thing it had been doing since the creak outside Caldwell when she had first put her hand over his. He said his own vows with equal clarity, looking at her face rather than at the words he had written, because he knew the words and did not need them as a crutch, and because he wanted her to know that he was speaking to her specifically, the actual her, the one he had ridden 60 miles beside and turned a horse around for, and asked to build a life with him. Gerald Halstead hosted a small wedding supper at a room above the saloon, the respectable upstairs room, not the drinking room below, and Martha Haller had brought a cake that she had somehow transported 60 miles without significant damage, and the small gathering was warm and loud, and full of the quality that belongs to genuine celebrations as opposed to performed ones. At some point in the evening, Reuben found himself standing with Halstead near the window while Grace was occupied in conversation with Martha. He had a cup of coffee. Halstead had a whiskey. "You turned this out all right," Halstead said. "She did," Reuben said, watching Grace laugh at something Martha had said, her whole face opening up in the way it did when she genuinely found something funny. "You both did," Halstead said, with the slightly gruff warmth that was his version of sentiment. "I'll tell you something. When Drummond's letter came in, I wasn't sure how I felt about what you'd done, but then I started asking around about the man. The last woman he brought out," he paused and shook his head. "She didn't last 6 months. Left on foot in January. That is enough for me." Reuben said nothing, but he set his coffee cup down and looked at his wife. That word was still new and remarkable, and felt the full weight of what had almost been allowed to happen, and also the full weight of what had instead happened, and both of those feelings were considerable and real, and he held them both. "Thank you," he said to Halstead, "for managing Drummond, and for keeping me on." "You're a good man, Wilcox," Halstead said, which from Halstead was a significant declaration. "Buy your wife a house and stop sleeping above the livery," Reuben laughed. "Working on it," he said. "The house came within 4 months. It was not large, but it was solid, a whitewashed frame building 2 streets from the school, with a real kitchen and 2 bedrooms and a porch that faced west, so you got the evenings, which Reuben had decided were the best part of a Kansas day. He built the bookshelves himself, which took 3 weekends and more than a few creative decisions about angles that he attributed to the character of hand-built things rather than to any imprecision in his measurements. Grace filled the shelves. Books appeared from everywhere, a package from a bookshop in Wichita, gifts from Mrs. Petty, a crate that arrived from Cincinnati that turned out to be sent by a former colleague who had heard Grace had married and wanted to send her something. The books arranged themselves on the shelves with the comfortable familiarity of occupants who intended to stay, and Grace made Reuben tell her which of his were favorites and gave them places of honor, including the Longfellow, which she dusted with particular care. She kept teaching at the school. The school board, initially uncertain about the propriety of a married woman in the classroom, was convinced by Mr. Aldis's near-desperate advocacy and the simple fact that the children were learning things at a rate that had not been seen in Caldwell before. She had a gift for finding the particular way into a particular child's understanding, and she used it without reserve. Reuben continued working for Halstead, but on different terms now. He took routes that allowed him to be home most evenings, and on the routes that required overnight travel, he left in the mornings with the specific and anticipatory pleasure of a man who has something genuine to come back to. Their first winter in the house was the finest winter either of them could remember, which was partly the weather. It was an unusually mild Kansas winter, and partly the fact of being in a house with another person you love, with its own specific pleasures, the ordinary warmth of shared mornings and shared suppers, and the long evenings by the fire when they talked or read or simply existed in the same room without any need to perform or explain themselves. He woke sometimes in the night and listened to her breathing beside him, and felt a gratitude so large it almost frightened him. The way any large real thing is slightly frightening, because it means there is something to lose. He had spent years being a man with not much to lose, and he had not realized until now how much of that had felt, underneath the competence and the professional reliability, like a kind of poverty. In the spring of their second year, Grace told him on a morning in March that she was expecting a child. She told him over breakfast, setting down her coffee cup and looking at him across the table with those direct brown eyes, and his reaction was first silence, then a sound that was not quite words, then the rather undignified experience of nearly upsetting his own coffee cup when he got up from the table, which she laughed at even as her eyes were bright with the emotion of the moment. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hands in his. "Are you?" he started and did not know how to finish. "I'm well," she said. "I'm more than well. I'm very glad." "So am I," he said, and his voice was rougher than he intended because he was, in fact, very glad in a way that went past language. He was very careful with her after that, in ways that she found alternately touching and exasperating. She told him firmly that she was not fragile, and that she would continue teaching through the spring and into the summer as long as she was capable, and that she would be the judge of when she was no longer capable. He agreed with this, not because he thought it was fully correct, but because he understood that her autonomy was one of the things she had come to him with, and it was not something he would take from her, even in the service of worry. She taught through May. In June the school broke for summer, which coincided with her reaching the point at which she agreed that perhaps resting was more sensible than not resting. She spent the summer reading and corresponding with a woman in Topeka who was organizing a campaign for women's education access in Kansas, which she had become passionate about in ways that Reuben admired and sometimes struggled to keep up with intellectually, which she found amusing. "You keep reading," she told him, pointing at the bookshelves. "I have left you several that would be helpful." "Are you assigning me reading?" he said. "I am a teacher," she said serenely. "It is what I do." He read them. They were helpful. Their son was born in late August of 1880, on a warm evening with a thunderstorm building to the west, as if the weather intended to mark the occasion. The doctor came, and Mrs. Petty came, and Reuben stayed outside the bedroom door for the longest 2 hours of his life, feeling entirely useless and full of a focused prayer that he had not attempted since he was a child in Missouri. When the baby's first sound came through the door, that specific sound, unmistakable and absolute, he sat down heavily on the floor of the hallway and put his face in his hands and breathed. When they let him in, Grace was sitting up against the pillows, pale and tired and radiant in the way that a person is radiant when they have just done something extraordinary, and she was holding a small bundle that was already, at approximately 20 minutes old, making very emphatic opinions about the world known through sound. "He's loud," Reuben managed, looking down at his son. "He is your child," Grace said, with a tired and beautiful smile. "Of course he is." They named him James, after Reuben's father and grandfather both. James Reuben Wilcox, which was a serious name for a person who was currently expressing himself in a register that rattled the windows, but which they both agreed he would grow into. He grew into it. He was a bright, energetic boy who had his mother's eyes and his father's constitution, and the combined stubbornness of both parents in a concentration that caused Reuben to reflect, privately, that this was perhaps a natural consequence of the selection process. Gerald Halstead retired in the spring of 1881, at which point Reuben, with Grace's full consultation and encouragement, purchased a portion of Halstead's operation, the local freight routes, and ran them himself. It was a modest enterprise, but it was his own, and it grew steadily. He hired 2 men within the first year and a third by the following winter. He was good at the business, not only because he knew the land and the routes, but because he was honest with people and they knew it. Grace returned to teaching in the autumn after James's first birthday, bringing him to Mrs. Petty's in the mornings. Mrs. Petty had become a devoted honorary grandmother, a role she occupied with tremendous enthusiasm and what appeared to be an inexhaustible supply of gingerbread. The school had grown, and Grace had been given primary responsibility for the upper grades, which suited her considerably better. She was also now on a committee with the County Education Board, pressing for a longer school year and a proper curriculum for older students who currently had no option but to travel to Wichita or Topeka for further education. In the evenings, they sat on their west-facing porch and watched the Kansas sky do what it did with the dying light. And Grace read while Reuben sometimes whittled and sometimes just sat and looked at the land. James, when he was old enough, sat between them and asked questions about everything. The name of the star appearing low in the west, the reason the cottonwood pods floated, whether the coyote they could hear far off was talking to someone or just talking. Grace answered most of the questions. Reuben answered the ones about coyotes. On a warm September evening in 1882, when James was 2 and beginning to express his personality with some force, Reuben came home from his route to find Grace in the kitchen with a particular quality of expression that he had learned to recognize. "Again," he said, and could not keep the smile from his face. "Again," she confirmed. And then she was laughing, and he was holding her in the middle of the kitchen, and James was pulling at both their legs, deeply uncertain about this development but unwilling to be excluded. Their second child arrived the following spring, a girl this time, born on an April morning when the meadowlarks were already singing in the grass east of town. They named her Alina for Grace's mother, and she arrived in the world with a deliberate quiet that was in marked contrast to her brother's entrance. She looked at everything with enormous, considering eyes, and Reuben said within the first hour of her life that she was already assessing the situation. "She is definitely mine," Grace said. James took his role as older brother with the specific seriousness of a 2-year-old who has decided this new arrival is interesting, though he reserved judgment about whether it was as interesting as the neighbor's dog, which was, in his current estimation, the most interesting thing in Caldwell. The years moved the way years do when they are full quickly and richly, each one containing more than the previous year's version of yourself could have anticipated. The town grew. The school grew. Reuben's freight operation grew. They added a proper front room to the house, and a larger bedroom for the children when Alina graduated from her cradle to a bed of her own, and a garden along the south side of the house that Grace tended with great ambition and moderate success, though the gooseberry bushes she planted in the 3rd year became, over time, genuinely productive. The gooseberry bushes became a source of considerable private significance. Every summer when the berries came in, Grace made preserve small glass jars lined up on the kitchen shelf, and Reuben bought fresh bread from the baker on 2nd Street. And on those mornings they had gooseberry preserves on their bread, and the specific completeness of a small recurring happiness was something Reuben had decided on reflection was one of the definitions of a good life. He told her this one morning, over the bread and the preserves. She looked at him across the breakfast table. James, at 4, was eating his bread with a concentration that excluded all other considerations. Alina, at 2, was making a project of the preserves that was not entirely limited to eating them. "You are very sentimental for a man who presented himself as purely practical," Grace said. "I have revised my self-presentation," he said. "I noticed," she said, and smiled at him in the particular way that she had not wide, not performed, just the real and private warmth of a person smiling at someone they love. In the autumn of 1885, when James was 5 and in his mother's classroom, a circumstance that he found simultaneously thrilling and alarming, because his mother was apparently a more exacting teacher than he had realized. Reuben was riding back from a delivery to the eastern settlement when he came over a rise in the road and stopped. The Prairie was doing something he had seen before, but never quite gotten used to: a massive hawk migration passing through. Hundreds of birds riding the thermal currents above the grasslands, circling in great lazy spirals before drifting south. He sat on Bishop. Bishop had been replaced 2 years earlier by another roan, whom he had also named Bishop, because at this point it felt like a title rather than a name, and watched the hawks for 20 minutes, not because he had to, but because certain things require the courtesy of your full attention. He thought about the road he had ridden for the first time with a sealed letter in his breast pocket and a woman's name on a piece of paper, and the way the morning light had looked in that April, and the way everything had pivoted on a single moment outside Red Fork when he had been unable to do the thing he was supposed to do. He thought about what he would have been doing now if he had handed her over. He would be on some other road, on some other route, doing the work well, coming back to nothing in particular, growing smaller in the specific way he had told her he feared. Instead, he was watching hawks in the autumn sky and thinking about going home to a house that smelled of bread and wood smoke, and the particular organized chaos of two small children, and a woman who was probably at this moment at the school with his son in her classroom, teaching him something he would remember. He turned Bishop toward Caldwell. He arrived home an hour before Grace, which was enough time to start the fire and begin a pot of the beef soup he had learned to make reasonably well over the past several years. He had also, in a gesture that was perhaps unnecessary, but that he had decided to make anyway, cut some of the late asters from the garden and put them in a jar on the table. Grace came through the door with James, who announced at once that he had learned today that rivers go to the sea, which seemed to him an important discovery, and with a leaner on her hip, she had collected a leaner from Mrs. Petty on her way through town. Alina looked at Reuben with the assessing gaze that was her primary mode of regarding the world, then extended her arms toward him with the air of someone deciding to extend a privilege. He took her. She settled against his shoulder with complete confidence. Grace set down her bag and her books and saw the asters on the table. She stopped. She looked at him over Alina's head. "What are these for?" she asked. "Nothing in particular," he said. "Just because they were there." She crossed the room and kissed him, not the quick practical kiss of a person moving through a domestic evening, but the real kind, the kind that said something, and James said, from the doorway with the theatrical disgust of a 5-year-old, which made Alina laugh, and the soup was bubbling on the stove, and outside the October sun was doing its amber business with the western sky. There was a Sunday in the spring of 1887, their 9th spring in Caldwell, their 8th spring together in the house, when they all went out to the creek for the afternoon. It was one of those days that seems designed to justify the existence of spring, warm and clear with the cottonwoods just leafed out and the meadowlarks in full voice. James, now 7, waded in the shallows with his boots off, and a focused expression that suggested he was engaged in some significant enterprise. Alina, 5, sat beside her mother on the bank and was being read to from a picture book, occasionally looking up to make pronouncements about the illustrations. Reuben sat with his back against a cottonwood and his hat over his eyes, not quite asleep and not quite awake, the best kind of afternoon state. Grace finished the book and Alina ran off to join her brother in some water-related project, and Grace moved to sit beside Reuben. He shifted his hat and looked at her. She was looking at the children with the expression she wore when she was content, not the careful, composed contentment of earlier years, but the full, unguarded kind. "Do you remember what you said?" she asked. "When I asked you why you didn't hand me over?" "Most of it," he said. "You said you would rather lose the job than watch me walk through a door that frightened me," she said. "You said you wanted to be the one who was there, at my table, in my life." "I remember," he said. "You are," she said simply. "I want you to know that you are." He reached over and took her hand, the same way she had taken his on the bank of this same creek years ago, and she held his hand with the ease of something that has long since become the most natural thing in the world. James shouted something from the water about having found a very significant rock. Alina disputed its significance. The meadowlarks continued their editorial commentary. The creek went on with its ancient and indifferent business. The cottonwoods made their soft, rushing sound in the warm air. Reuben Wilcox sat beside his wife on the bank of a creek outside Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1887, and held her hand, and felt the full and overwhelming and ordinary goodness of the life he was living. The life that had been impossible to predict and perfectly inevitable, that had begun on a prairie road with a sealed letter and a woman's frightened eyes, and the decision that some things were simply not possible, no matter what you had been sent to do. He had been sent to deliver her to another man, and he had found at the final moment that he could not. And the world had turned on that single impossibility, and had become everything he had not known how to name for himself, but had apparently, quietly and specifically, been reaching toward for all the years before the morning he rode into Caldwell with a hollow feeling in his chest, and found her waiting at the edge of everything he was about to become. Later, walking back through the town in the long gold light of the evening, each of them holding a child's hand, Elena already insisting she could walk herself, but conceding to hold her father's hand as a courtesy, Grace leaned against Reuben's shoulder briefly, just for a moment, as they walked. "I should write to Martha Haller," she said. "I never write to her as often as I should." "You should," he agreed. "She'll want to know about the Astors," Grace laughed. "She'll want to know nothing of the kind. She'll want to know if you have built any more shelves." "I built very good shelves," Reuben said with dignity. "You built creative shelves," Grace said. "There is a difference." James looked up at his father with the forensic interest of a child who senses there is a story here worth having. "What shelves?" he asked. "The bookshelves in the front room," Grace said. "The ones that are a little crooked," James asked. "Character," Reuben said. "I have explained this." Elena, on Grace's other side, appeared to be considering the question of the shelves with her characteristic deliberation. "I like them," she announced finally. "They have personality." Grace looked at Reuben over the children's heads. She was trying not to smile and failing entirely. He looked back at her with the feeling that had no single word for it. The feeling of being fully known and fully loved by the same person simultaneously, which is the specific and remarkable condition that the luckiest people in the world find themselves in, and which Reuben Wilcox had spent 4 years on the road without, and would spend the rest of his life grateful for. They walked home through the evening, the 4 of them in the warm Kansas light, into the house that smelled of wood smoke and books and gooseberry preserves, and everything that a life built on an honest and unlooked-for love accumulates over years of ordinary days, which are never, in truth, entirely ordinary at all. And in Red Fork, 60 miles west, Silas Drummond eventually placed another advertisement in a different newspaper, and that is a different story entirely, and not one that anyone in the Wilcox household spent any further time considering, because their own story was far too full and far too good to leave any room for other ones.